Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at some of the best and most important paleontological papers to come out in April 2023. So let's get started. The first paper we're going to be looking at is on a Tanystrophiid. The Tanystrophiids are this group of really long-necked reptiles that lived during the Triassic, and they're, from what we know at least, mostly aquatic. There's a new one though coming from China, and it's been named Gracilicollum latens, and it comes from the middle Triassic. It really helps to fill in this gap between animals like Macronymus, which was more land-based, and then the later, more derived Tanystrophiids like Tanystrophius, which were mostly living in the water. It's also interesting though, because Gracilicollum also would have lived at the same time as Macronymus. So hypothetically, somewhere further back in the fossil record, there should be something that's even more transitionary from that land-based lifestyle into the water. So hopefully we'll keep looking and be able to find something that's a little more conclusive on how exactly this strange group of reptiles became what they were. Staying in the Triassic but moving closer to mammals while still not being mammals, we're going to be looking at the Dicynodonts. These would be larger animals, kind of like Lizovickia, but also some smaller ones like Lystrosaurus. And it's really interesting because there hasn't been a lot of work done on their phylogeny, and this paper starts some of that work. The researchers looked at many examples of the lower jaw in the animal Dinodontosaurus brevirostris, and they found that there were a couple of kind of unique features, at least relative to its closest relatives, other species in the genus Dinodontosaurus. For example, Dinodontosaurus brevirostris actually has this kind of angular trough through parts of the mandible, and we don't see that same trough in the other species of Dinodontosaurus, Dinodontosaurus tenor. So what that means is when we're looking at the entire phylogeny of these animals, there's multiple convergent evolutionary features that are showing up, and it's just really highlighting how we need to really understand these animals a lot better. Unfortunately though, a lot of them are really partial, so understanding them better isn't exactly just going to happen that easily. We need to get people on the ground to actually look at some of these fossils. And before we move on to the next paper, I do want to give a shout out to Hattie George for helping with this, because this kind of mammal and mammal relative evolution is something I'm not great on, and he was able to help out and give me some information on how I should be looking at some of these figures and whatnot, because not my strong suit. All of that said though, we're still going to be staying in the Triassic and with some mammal relatives, but this time closer to mammals, specifically with the animals Prozostrodon and Therioherpeton. These were stem mammals that lied a lot closer to the actual mammal lineage than things like the Dicynodonts were. And this is important because one of the things we associate with mammals is an increase in brain size. But what the researchers actually found is these two animals, relative to some of their relatives, actually decreased their brain size first. Now, that could have been because there was this kind of novel brain adaptation, being the neocortex over the top. It could have been just higher neuron density, or maybe they did just have smaller brains that weren't changed that much. But it is important for understanding how the mammal brain may have started to evolve. So hopefully we'll get a few more studies on animals that are even closer to that first actual mammal and try and see if we can try and parse together how mammal brains evolved, because it's important for understanding how mammals became so successful. Staying in the Triassic, we're going to be looking at a new Rhynchosaur coming from the Triassic of Wyoming. The Rhynchosaurs were these weird or mostly herbivorous reptiles that would have hung around on land and not gotten super huge, but were definitely still a major player in some ecosystems. This one's really interesting, coming from the Popo-Aggie Formation. It's been named Beesiiwo cooowuse and would have lived about 230 million years ago. It's important because it groups with mostly North American Rhynchosaurs, but also there were other Rhynchosaurs in North America that weren't limited to just North America, meaning that you also had some more widespread global species, but some that were highly endemic like this one. So there's a really complicated kind of hodgepodge of evolution that's occurring in the Rhynchosaurs during the Triassic, which is interesting because all of the continents were together in Pangaea. You might expect it to be more universal across all these ecosystems, and that's just not what we see. And it really highlights how we need to sample many different areas to really get a true understanding of how diverse some of these groups might have been. And moving past the Triassic into the Jurassic, we're going to be looking at Jarkskjagnath, which was this relatively large ramphorhynchid pterosaur coming from the Middle Jurassic. And as far as we can tell, it's the largest named pterosaur coming from the Jurassic. So its discovery was really cool. However, now from the same place on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, there's new fossils coming out of even larger pterosaurs. This one though is really just one wing and it's kind of busted up, so we can't say if it's the same species or if it's a different one, but it does show that they could at least get bigger during the Jurassic. So whether it was Jark or another entirely different species, there were large pterosaurs much earlier than we previously thought. When an animal makes something like an eggshell, it needs to take pieces of its own body and build that eggshell. And when they're building their body, they're taking in different isotopes of different elements from their environment. And based on different features of those isotopes, we can tell some things about the animal. Meaning that if we have eggshells from something that's kind of like a Troodon, which lots of taxonomy issues with Troodon, I'm going to deal with that in a separate video. But if you take something like an eggshell from an animal that was like Troodon, you can measure the isotopes in it and see some things about its body. For example, some of these eggs show, hey, this animal was pretty warm when it laid these eggs, probably around 42 degrees Celsius. But then there's other ones that are around 30 degrees Celsius, which is kind of funny. It's a little strange to see that much variation, and I think a lot of that variation comes down to just dinosaurs aren't birds. Birds are dinosaurs, but Troodon, not a bird. So there's not the same kind of metabolism in its body. It also means that Troodon was probably making its eggshell a lot slower than modern birds do. Birds can make their eggshell super quick so they can lay their clutches pretty much all at once or within a few days. But we still have some Troodon nests with a good amount of eggs, which kind of begs the question, did more than one Troodon lay all their eggs in the same nest? It's something that we do see in some birds today, and it would be very interesting to find out for sure, but I don't know if we're going to know for sure. Right now, this is just kind of answering some questions about the dinosaur metabolism and potentially posing some questions for future research. On the subject of bird and bird-like dinosaur metabolism, there is another paper that CT scanned a bunch of skulls to try and look at their nasal passages. In birds, it's a really important way for them to expel heat. They're able to help thermoregulate by using their nasal passageways. And what the researchers found is that even in relatively close to bird animals, like Velociraptor, they didn't have that same kind of setup, meaning that their thermoregulatory system was still distinctly different from the birds, and that the bird's modern system for dealing with heat exchanges probably evolved in them rather than some previous ancestor. So it's something entirely unique to the birds, at least based on this study. There might be some more fossils that are even closer to birds, well, not being birds, that might show that it's actually just a little bit older than the birds, but we need to look into that in a little bit more detail. There was also a look at some of the metabolism and growth of Stratiotosuchus, a land-based crocodilian from the late Cretaceous of Brazil. And what the researchers found is pretty interesting because rather than growing kind of slow like most modern crocodilians did, it instead grew super fast. And part of the idea is that this is niche partitioning, where they got up to their maximum size and then dominated that kind of middle-sized predator niche, whereas the dinosaurs that were even larger could still hunt larger prey. There was a specific niche there for this kind of mid-sized carnivore. But it might have also just been kind of a defensive adaptation to avoid predation, because as it stays smaller, it's more likely to get eaten by a larger dinosaur. But once they got up to fully grown size, which would have been about a lion size, they would have still had a pretty fearsome bite and been potentially able to fend off larger carnivores at least slightly better than they otherwise would have, thus allowing the species to continue instead of just all getting eaten. And now looking at Cretaceous reptiles, but this time more in the water, we're going to be looking at a plesiosaur coming from Australia. Umoonasaurus was found entirely preserved as opal. The bones became opalized. It's a really neat fossil. But these researchers went, well, is there something else inside of that? So they CT scanned the inside of what the stomach cavity would have been, and they found a number of different things. The first thing is gastroliths, these rocks that these animals swallowed to help grind up fish or whatever they were eating, as well as potentially help provide some ballast. There were also fish bones though, so we know it was eating fish. And it does seem like these kind of longish-necked plesiosaurs were more or less specializing on smaller prey, like small fish and potentially squid, but squid just don't preserve as well. But it does line up with what we thought we expected from this kind of animal's ecology. Staying with animals that had long necks and were in Australia, we're going to be looking at a sauropod, specifically Diamantinasaurus. It also, interestingly, doesn't really have a skull, or at least it didn't until this paper. With the skull being at the end of a very long neck, it's kind of easy for that to get washed away and just not get preserved, but now we have at least one skull from this animal. And it's interesting because it actually lines up phylogenetically closest with a similarly sized sauropod coming from South America. Now, at this time when these animals would have been evolving and migrating to different areas, South America, Antarctica, and Australia were all connected. So it's not entirely shocking that this animal was able to get to all of those continents, but it is important because of its phylogenetic implications, because this means that Diamantinasaurus was very close to the base of the Titanosaur group. The Titanosaurs are the largest dinosaurs. Things like Argentinosaurus or Puertosaurus, these really, really big, absolutely dominant animals on a landscape just because of their size, that's the Titanosaurs. So hopefully we can get a little bit more research done on things like Diamantinosaurus in order to better understand how these titanosaurs just became so massive and then also so successful, because they were around until the very end of the Cretaceous. So they did pretty well for themselves. And as these animals were evolving, they would have been feeding off of many different kinds of trees, and potentially while eating those trees, they might have run into some fungus. That's because a new study looked at some petrified wood coming from the Morrison Formation of the United States from about 145 million years ago. And what they found when looking at it under the microscope was small little structures that are indicative of mushroom or fungal growth. These little structures called hyphae would have gone into the wood and actually taken some of the nutrients into it. And it's unsure if this mushroom had a kind of fruiting body like the modern day chicken of the woods does. It's this really, really tasty and easy to find mushroom. And not knowing for sure if it had that means we can't necessarily say if the sauropods were actually deliberately feeding on mushrooms, but it's something that would be possible. We know mushrooms have a long evolutionary history, and it wouldn't be shocking to see them engaging in this kind of parasitism on trees that early on. Staying with the trees, there were 2 papers on fossil resins, which is just a nice way of saying they were looking at tree sap and amber and saying, hey, can we chemically tell anything about this? And the first one was just an overview. It talked about a lot of different methods that people have used to try and chemically understand amber and how it's preserved, and it's going to just serve as a really nice repository for that information. The second paper looked at the chemical structures that were present in amber coming from western part of Central Asia. A lot of the amber that we know of for these time periods comes from parts of northern and western Europe and some parts of Russia. So it's really interesting to see it this far east relative to what we know other places that have preserved amber. Additionally, though, it's not really that exciting. Unfortunately, the amber isn't very well preserved, so it's probably not going to get a major use in jewelry, which is why a lot of modern amber is dug up. There's also not really any mention of fossils being preserved in it, so it's probably going to take someone who's really dedicated to understanding this amber to really find out if there is anything worthwhile preserved in it. But there's more with trees going on, including all the way back from 365 million years ago in the late Devonian of Ireland. Ireland hasn't been well known for having many significant fossil discoveries, but this one actually is pretty significant when trying to understand the world that was developing at the Devonian. The Devonian is when the first forests really started to rise, and what was found at these sediments in Ireland is kind of the first logjam. Having a logjam just means that essentially there was some sort of flood that moved a whole bunch of logs all at once, and they made a traffic jam essentially, meaning that a lot of different sediment, but also potentially animals and some of those other trees also got blocked and then preserved, which is really fortunate for us to understand it. But this is also the earliest known logjam in the planet's history. So it shows that really quickly after the first forest started to rise up, there was enough tree density to get these kind of events to occur. Additionally, some of these preserved fossil trees actually have some boreholes into them, and it's not known what animal made these kind of boring holes into the trees, but it shows that there is something taking advantage of that kind of ecospace very early on after the first trees evolved. It wasn't something that waited until trees became established all across the world. It was kind of immediate. Staying in the Devonian but moving to the oceans of Morocco, there was a new Cladocellacean described. The Cladocellaceans were closely related to sharks, but not quite sharks, and this new one is pretty unique. Magriboselace mamazane is this new animal, and it had a kind of broad head compared to the other shark relatives of the time. And the researchers tried to understand why, and it seems like it facilitated this animal having a much larger eye than any of its relatives did. It also may have allowed the nasal passages to be moved further apart from one another so that the animal could track smells and the direction of smells a little bit easier. It's kind of similar to what we actually do see in the modern day hammerhead sharks, which have their nostrils out on the end so they can better track smells as well as do a few other things. As for this animal though, it seems like it was pretty close to the split between modern day sharks and their closest modern day relatives, the chimeras. So it really helps to show how diverse this group actually was before the end Devonian extinction, after which the sharks, the chondrichthyans, their relatives, were able to become much, much more diverse. And it seems like it may have been because they already had a lot of ecospace. So they were already pretty diverse, the extinction happened and many of those lineages made it through and then were able to expand their ecospace. But none of those sharks or their relatives were the apex predators in the Devonian seas. That honor would go to Dunkleosteus, which from a previous video I already talked about actually got shrunk down quite a bit. And this paper is by the same author and just uses some different methods to go, yeah, it seems like it was probably a lot smaller than we had thought. A major portion of this has been comparing the mouth size of things like Dunkleosteus to those of modern day sharks and then just extrapolating from there how big it would have been. But this researcher was able to quantitatively and qualitatively prove distinctively that shark mouths and arthrodire, so the group that includes things like Dunkleosteus, don't have the same mouth to length ratios. You really can't compare apples to oranges. This just means that rather than comparing something like Dunkleosteus to a modern day great white based on head measurements, we should be comparing Dunkleosteus to one of its close relatives that we have an entire body length for, and then trying to find the same kind of ratio for its body length. And that does line up with what this author had published previously, and so yeah, they shrunk the dunk. There were still a lot of really strange animals after the end Devonian extinction though, one of which was Tolli monstrum, which is so strange I did an entire separate video in that. And the thing is, at the end of that video I go, yeah, it's probably a vertebrate because of these lists of reasons. A new paper came out though, and they were micro-CT scanning it to try and understand the whole three-dimensional space that the fossils took up, and they came to the conclusion that it probably wasn't a vertebrate. So the jury's still out a little bit. Specifically, they found a number of issues with the idea it was a vertebrate, including the kind of segmentation of the head leading into the body, which just doesn't really work on vertebrate bodies. So it seems like it may not have been a vertebrate. Now, it still could be closely related as a non-vertebrate chordate, so this would be something like a really, really large lancelet, which we do still have today. But it also could have been some kind of protostome, which narrows it down almost not at all. Protostomes are a massive group of animals. They include the mollusks, and the worms, and the brachiopods, and half a dozen other things. They were incredibly, incredibly diverse. So it's not really that helpful to just say it's vaguely some kind of protostome. We really need to do a little bit more to understand what may have been happening with Tolli monstrum and what exactly the heck it was. As for something we can tell what it is, there's a new pachycephalosaurid coming from the Hell Creek Formation. This new one's been named Platytholus clemensi, and the Hell Creek Formation is already known for having some pachycephalosaur fossils, but this just really helps to add to their diversity, because it doesn't really fit into the kind of growth series that's been proposed for some of the other pachycephalosaurs in Hell Creek. So we know there were at least 2 species knocking about, and potentially 3 depending on who you talk to. So it's really interesting to see this growing diversity of pachycephalosaurs as we continue to investigate even well-searched places like the Hell Creek Formation. Staying in central North America, and specifically Iowa, we're going to be moving much, much closer to the modern day with the fossil of a saber-toothed cat, specifically Smilodon. Now, this is actually super interesting because most Smilodon fossils we get come from the California site that's super famous, the La Brea tar pits. But famously, Iowa and California aren't super close together, so it's really nice to get one of these additional data points to understand the kind of distribution that Smilodon had during the Pleistocene. This fossil is also pretty recent. In fact, it's so recent that we can still use carbon dating on it because it's only about 13,000 years old. So it's still really useful to understand exactly how old this animal is and show that they were pretty well spread up until about 13,500 years ago across North America. Additionally, that means they can compare it to the dates of a whole bunch of other Smilodon fossils. What this means is that they were probably doing pretty well across their entire range until something that happened universally across the entire range, and humans had already shown up in that range, happened that just changed the environments. And it's something that Smilodon just couldn't keep up with, and they went extinct. But it is really interesting to see that it was kind of a coordinated event where they just all went extinct everywhere at once. There's also a discovery of a new species of saber-toothed cat, this time coming from the Tibetan Plateau in China. Amphimacrotis heshengensis is this new species, and it shows some important things about saber-toothed cat evolution. For example, its eyes were relatively wider on its head, meaning that it probably was looking over a pretty wide and open area as opposed to trying to focus on a single target or trying to climb up a single tree in a forest. So it's a much more open environment that these animals were adapted to. There's also another fossil in the region that is probably from a saber-toothed cat that shows an injury on the foot. And this injury would have slowed it down after it healed because it looks like some of the hand bones actually fused together, which isn't ideal if you're running after prey. However, it still looks like this animal survived for quite a while after this injury, meaning that rather than being some major detriment, it may have actually had help in surviving. They may have already been adapting to living in prides, kind of like modern-day lions do. Unlike the fossils from Iowa, though, these ones are much, much older, being around 9 million years old. That also means that potentially by 9 million years ago, the large cats, including these saber-toothed cats, were already living in prides. It's a really neat adaptation to see them adopting so early on, especially since pack or pride living doesn't seem to be super widespread in modern-day cats. And staying in the ice ages, the one nice thing about permafrost melting is we can get lots of really great fossils, like the mammoth cube that's been memed all over paleo Twitter and paleo Facebook meme pages. It's been around. But that also means we can get genetic information from many of these woolly mammoths that we find frozen in the permafrost. And that means we can compare their genes directly to the genes of modern-day elephants and understand what kind of path they might have taken to become successful during the ice ages. And it seems like there were specific rapid changes on the genes that dealt with producing hair, producing skin, the fat metabolism, and the immune system. So they were dealing with a slightly different set of bacteria and infections, which makes sense. That can evolve. That's really easy to rapidly evolve because if a sickness wipes out all the ones that are weak to it, only the ones that can survive will be left. So that kind of part makes sense. But the more interesting part was the parts with the other genes, because those genes were changing up until they went extinct pretty much. There's still a lot of evolution happening in the woolly mammoths as they came into and out of major cold spells. Because the Ice Age wasn't just one single push of the ice sheets, it was many advances and retreats of the ice sheets. So sometimes they could get a little bit warmer and sometimes it would be a little bit colder. And they were constantly adapting to that up until they went extinct, which sucks they went extinct, but I guess they just needed to adapt faster. And jumping from the more recent ice ages to 600 to 650 million years ago, we're looking at how life got through one of the most devastating periods in Earth's history, which was the snowball Earth. And we know life made it through because we have fossils from before it and after it, and a few isolated algae fossils during it. Well, some researchers tried to find it out, and they were looking at some algae fossils coming from this time period. And that means we can hopefully understand their environment and see how they were able to survive. There were a few different options that the authors proposed as to what was the likely scenario for the deposition of this rock and the preservation of the algae. Now, the first one is, there may have been small ponds which formed on top of the glaciers. As the glacier grows, it's going to pick up some of the dirt from the ground underneath, and as that might become collected, it could allow differential melting on top of the glacier, with those small ponds allowing life to persist. There's also the more traditional model with the equator being less frozen so that life may have survived there, and there's also the slush ball model. Normally this time period is called snowball Earth, but if it was more slushy, that means there may have been smaller pockets or even entire holes through the entire glacier that was covering the northern or southern hemispheres. And with light persisting through those holes, it may have had the conditions for life to still continue. So it's this really interesting look at how life got through what might have been one of the toughest times in our planet's climatic history. The interesting part, though, is that these algae fossils come from the Songluo biota, which would have been in northern China, which at the time was not near the equator, which makes that first hypothesis, or the third one, a little bit more likely. And as for a paper I couldn't really tie in well anywhere else, we're looking at some of the oldest bat fossils known. These also come from the Green River Formation, where other bat fossils are known from, but importantly, we have really good stratigraphic control of the Green River Formation. meaning by looking at the different layers, we know how old each of these layers are, and these are the oldest bats. It's actually a newly named species from an already known genus, this new species being Echinonicterus gunneli. And the way it pairs with some of the other North American bats and some of the European ones from a similar time period, it really helps to show that the North American bats and the European bats are entirely separate lineages. It's not like they started in North America and all of the same bats spread across the world and you have the same lineage in both of those places. Instead, no, they spread to these different areas and then diversified separately. So they already had really good range coverage very early in their evolution, which is unfortunate because it'd be nice to know kind of where they came from, because bats just show up in the fossil record out of nowhere. And then we have other papers that I've already done entirely separate videos on. The first of these is going to be a paper on how intelligent could dinosaurs have gotten. Could we have gotten a dinosauroid like was proposed in the 80s, where it's a very human-like dinosaur? And it doesn't necessarily look at the body shape, more just the intelligence level. And it generally finds, yeah, they probably couldn't, because reptile brains are just set up fundamentally differently. There was also a new silosaurid found coming from the Carnian of South America. I actually got comments from the authors on this paper saying that they liked the video, so I recommend you go check that whole thing out. The silosaurs are really interesting because they might or may not be dinosaurs depending on who you're talking to. And this new one, Umoonasaurus nesbitti, well, super partial shows that A, they got to similar sizes as other dinosaurs in the environment, but also helps to support the idea that they were the first ornithischian dinosaurs, which hopefully we'll get one that's not as partial so we can really conclusively show that. There's also a paper on trying to use fancy machines to look at fossils. And by fancy machines, I mean particle accelerators and really high density X-rays. And what they found is it can be super useful. They stuck some bones in and also sawed open the same bones and compared the data from each of those. And we're able to see many of the same lines. So hopefully we'll get some more research in that part of the field so we can understand the advantages that using particle accelerators actually gives to paleontologists. There's also one of the first herbivores known in the fossil record named Melanodaphodon. It's related to Edaphosaurus, which was one of the first really big-bodied herbivores in the fossil record, but this one is older, about 35 million years older. So it really helps to push back the presence of vertebrates eating plants to quite a bit earlier. There was also a study looking at the fossil Tarchia, an ankylosaur coming from Mongolia, and this one specifically died because it had a very bad infection in its nose. Now, there's a couple different ways this could have happened. It could have been bitten by something like a Tarbosaurus, but we don't know for sure. It may have also just been an intraspecies combat injury. There's been a lot of growing evidence that these animals had their tail clubs and whatnot in order to fight one another as opposed to fighting off something like a predator. So it's very possible that it just got clubbed in the face and that caused this infection in its nose, which eventually led to its death, either through not being able to feed through pain or just not being able to breathe properly. There was also a look at Ursactus, a new fossil worm coming from the Burgess Shale that shows us a lot about how fossil worms grow differently than modern worms. There's a lot of great detail that the paper goes into, so if you want more on that, it really would behoove you to check out the video. There's also a newly named land crocodilian coming from the Eocene of France, Diamantinasaurus. And this is really interesting because it may have been the largest predator on land after the dinosaurs went extinct. But it is really interesting to think that even for millions of years after the extinction of the non-bird dinosaurs, that mammals were still running in fear from large reptiles. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Feel free to join our Patreon. We have a lot of great backers. We also have a Discord where we might be group watching Prehistoric Planet later. Yeah, lots of really neat stuff this month. With all that in mind, be safe, take care, and do not go extinct.